Easter season. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. This is the last Sunday of the Easter season. There will be the 50 days of Easter complete, and next week we celebrate the Ascension, and the first Sunday of June begins Pentecost. So over the season of Easter, we see all the ways in which Jesus' grieving disciples saw and recognized the risen Lord and found their grief turn to joy. And every year, even though, we've heard it over and over, we take the time to read these things because we too, so many centuries later, are still often grieving for similar reasons. It's very common, in fact, to see people broken and grieving over losses that sometimes they know what they are and sometimes they're not sure how to define it. They search for something to give meaning and shape to life and then feel that they've lost it. And it's not just, something that kids go through at adolescence. It happens a lot of times over life. When a child is born and life changes, when the children go to school, certainly after a divorce, when the children leave home, retirement brings its very own challenges, as I've learned. An illness, a change in our abilities, any of those times when we're seeking new direction, there's a loss and a grieving and a need for the presence of God. Today's lessons speak to us of Jesus' presence and the healing that it brings. The three are set together because each sees the need for Jesus' presence and healing in a different way. In the gospel lesson, Jesus is addressing the loss that his own disciples will feel in their hearts and spirits. The story from Acts follows a long story about the brokenness within the community. And the vision from Revelation sees the needs of the whole world for the coming of the risen Christ and the healing of the nations. When we're in any kind of pain, our first reaction is always just to ask for the pain to stop. But it's clear from the scope of this biblical vision that healing means more than just pain relief. It's too simple to just say, you do this or you take that and you think these thoughts and immediately everything will be all right. It's also too simple to say that time heals brokenness. It can be true, but it can also be true that time will kill and destroy. We need time for healing, but we need to use that time well. According to the scriptures, we need time in the presence of the healer who is the creator, who knows us from the beginning, who knows what we were meant to be and what our world was meant to be. Healing comes from the presence of God. So let's listen to the stories. We'll begin as Jesus did with a few broken and frightened individuals, a little group. And throughout the whole of this well-known discourse from John's Gospel, Jesus is telling them that he has to leave. He has to die. They're trying to accept that and to understand why, and they're not getting it. Their hearts are confused and worried, and they're left with a sense of being left entirely alone, a sense of abandonment. With Jesus among them, they had begun to feel well, to feel powerful, and now they just feel sick and powerless. And they believe that there's nothing they can do. If Jesus can't save himself, how are they going to save him? And how is he going to save them? So Jesus is having a long talk with them. It covers 3 or 4 chapters. He's trying to tell them to find healing for their broken spirits. At least, he says, when enough time has passed, you'll remember what I'm saying now. It's not hard for us to understand these feelings. It's the loss we know when we mourn someone or something in our lives that has helped to tell us who we are. When you lose a person close to you, a family member, when you lose a job, and for a time you don't know who you are anymore. You have to find yourself again. When these men had first found Jesus, they identified himself with him, became members of his group. They left their former places as fishermen or farmers or tax collectors, whatever they did, and they became wandering followers of Jesus. And now they're not sure who they'll be after Jesus is gone, but they are sure that they're going to feel very much alone. Jesus' words, and we just read a few of them today, assure them that they will still be doing the same things as before. They will be obeying the same commandments, the same teachings. Those come from God. They won't be gone, no matter what the world chooses to do with its power. They will not be alone. The Helper will come. Their spirits will be healed by the presence of the Holy Spirit, and they'll remember all Jesus' words, and they will have peace. Shalom, it says, just as he does. So in the days following the resurrection, the book of Acts tells us that Jesus' disciples did, in fact, experience that peace in their hearts, and it brought them joy. Now, you might think that with people who knew that peace, who then gathered to worship together, to share their good news, you would find a peaceful community. In fact, the whole is different from the sum of its parts, and the community itself has been from the beginning in need of healing too. Just the context of that story that Hermina read. With the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the people who lived in Palestine were scattered, and many of those who had been followers of the way of Jesus went north to Syria and regrouped in a place called Antioch. That was one of the first stops Saul made after he became Paul. At Antioch, Paul not only found willing hearers among the new Christians, but also among the Syrians. The new members he brought into the church were not so familiar with Jewish customs, eating habits, and so on. They were certainly not very keen about the practice of circumcision. So practices were different than they had been in Palestine. And Paul accepted that as part of the work that God was calling him to do in preaching the gospel to all the nations, even as far as Macedonia and over to Europe, as we heard. So anyway, while they were there in Antioch, there was a visit from some of the leaders of the Jerusalem church. It sounds actually kind of like a presbytery visitation to me, just a little bit. They kind of stir things up once in a while. Anyway, the visitors raised the matter of the failure of the new members to follow the old procedures, and it set off a fierce argument. There's no row like a church row, and it's been so from the very start. Paul defended his people, the elders stood their ground, and it seemed like there was no way to solve this one. No one was going to give in. Paul's work in converting the nations could very well have ended right there. But even in the pain and sorrow and grief of a fierce argument, the presence of the Spirit brings hope. There will be a way to live in this tension. There will be a way to work together. They all believed that. So when they couldn't find that way themselves, they decided to go to the next highest court in Jerusalem. They made the trip, which probably took them a couple of weeks. They reported to all the churches as they went along, and when they got to Jerusalem, the elders met. The debate was long and drawn out, and we only have half a chapter in Acts, so I guess the secretary decided not to put all of it in the minutes. Finally, Peter took Paul's side, and James proposed a compromise. The new members were to observe some very basic practices to show respect for others and for creation, and they were not to be bound by all the ceremonial laws, although they were supposed to read them and learn them. The work continued, and more of the Gentiles joined the church, even some women-led groups like Lydia's that Hermina read about this morning. This is not to oversimplify the healing of broken communities. The issue didn't just go away. It arose again in many new communities where Paul preached and drew in new members to the faith. The pressure for them to conform to ways they couldn't accept sometimes drove them away. And Paul's letters show that for him, it was a lifelong struggle to help his own people see that God really had spoken to the nations in Jesus. For Jewish Christians, the loss of their traditional practices was a great sorrow. Many of them could never accept it. They stayed in the synagogue and stopped talking about Jesus. Nonetheless, the church did continue and the message spread. The new community was wounded by its first internal conflict, but it didn't die. The meeting at Jerusalem set an example for how to resolve conflicts, to hear all the voices, to respect everyone involved. Among believers met in the presence of the risen Christ, there is hope and healing, and the Church of Christ is not lost. So that thought of healing from Jesus is comforting and hopeful. But as the vision of the need for healing grows, as we step back and look at the needs of the whole world, it becomes more difficult to hold on to that hope. I was at a gathering just on Friday night for the screening of a film that was made by a young woman who was from Burlington. She made the film to raise awareness about the huge loss of life occurring in the oceans, coral reefs, fish stocks, overfishing, climate change. The devastation is enormous, and it's been sudden, just within a few years, and has dire implications for the Earth's atmosphere and for the land. Passion, real and palpable fear for the whole planet filled the room as we watched her work. The brokenness and weakness of the nations was as clear as it would ever be in all our minds as we face the reality that no action will be taken to make the huge changes required to save the oceans. No one wants to despair, but hope is very hard to hold on to as we face the conflict with authority that will occur as people realize how much change needs to be made. Like the conflict with authority that Jesus was facing in trying to save the world. So if all of us are hurting and broken, if none of us can claim to be without need, and we are all part of a broken world, who is going to be the one to help us? I know we're very much inclined to look for strong leaders, people who somehow we perceive to be above and beyond the weakness that the rest of us know so well. After all, how can someone help us if he can't even get up himself? How can it help to see our suffering reflected in the eyes of the one we ask for help? We might be content to find someone strong enough to do what needs to be done for us, but we don't really know exactly what we need. We have to rely on that healer for insight and perception, as well as strength. If the healer has never known what it feels like, how will the need be perceived? Henry Nouwen spoke about a wounded healer, by which he meant Jesus first of all, who bore the pain of the cross, a victim of the broken world that crucifies the prophets, the broken community that betrays its leaders, the broken heart that loses all that's loved. Because he was wounded, Jesus is our healer, the other way to go. The miracle of Jesus and those who follow him is that from brokenness does not flow bitterness and anger and more destruction and more violence. From Jesus' wounds flow healing and peace. The vision of John of Patmos kept for us in the book of Revelation is the broadest vision of all. It encompasses all the universe as John imagined it. He had seen great sorrow before he had this vision. He'd seen the death of many of his fellow Christians at the hands of the Roman emperor. He knew prison and exile. He was seeing the empire at its most brutal, the world at its worst. If anyone should know the need for healing, it was John of Patmos. But the Spirit was with John and gave him vision. He did not dwell on his own personal sorrow, but saw the great sorrow and pain of the world that God loved so much. John saw the world's need for healing, the presence of the risen Christ. We read just a little bit of that vision, but if you have a few minutes, sit and read it through. There's a momentum to it when you read it all together. It gathers to a great climax of joy as the powers of evil are defeated at last, and the Lamb takes the throne, and the whole creation breaks forth into song. If our world seems to us to be hopeless, a complete disaster area, one war after another, famine in one place, floods in another, earthquakes somewhere else, children starving in our own streets even, and much worse to come as the earth's finite resources run low and the conflicts become more intense. It's not meant to tell us to leave it all up to God, but this vision is meant for us. It's meant to tell us that God, the powerful Creator, has begun to save the world. And we are invited to be part of that salvation, to be among those who endure the great tribulation and finally see the healing found in the New Jerusalem. We are invited, in following Christ, to become wounded healers, offering hope and peace to God's beloved world. Amen.